Nō mai, haere mai. Welcome. I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist, Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese have both been in New Zealand this week for the FIFA Women's World Cup. Is it about more than just sports? Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce. Thank you.
The two leaders also met with our Prime Minister Chris Hipkins and Foreign Minister Nanaia Mahuta. Mr Albanese has been here to New Zealand before, but would Mr Blinken have come if it wasn't for the football?
Well, it's a good question, but it does seem to reflect the priority that the US State Department has been putting in relation to New Zealand. Mr Blinken is just the fourth of senior officials from the US State Department to visit this country. We had Wendy Sherman, who was Blinken's deputy, and we had also Kurt Campbell visit. They're amongst four officials that have recently visited in New Zealand in the last year. So I think the Biden administration is warmly disposed towards the New Zealand government, and I think this reflects it. Mr. Blinken was actually scheduled, and he did carry out the commitment. He opened an embassy in Tonga. So it's not just New Zealand, it's just that New Zealand's part of a region where the US is getting increasingly active. And just a few months ago, well, in February actually, this year, the US opened an embassy in the Solomons. So, you know, I think the visit to New Zealand reflects both America's growing interest in the Pacific Islands states region, and B, this administration sees New Zealand as an important partner.
What would have been the topics that Hipkins and Mahuta discussed with Blinken and Albanese, do you think?
Well, I think it will be probably China and possibly AUKUS. And these are two sensitive subjects, and the meetings were occurring and are still occurring behind closed doors. So one commentator believed that Blinken had come over to New Zealand to strong-arm New Zealand into joining Pillar 2 of AUKUS. But my sense is that shortly after Kurt Campbell visited in March, the National Security Indo-Pacific coordinator, and he's a big fan of New Zealand, makes no bones about that. Shortly after the visit by Kurt Campbell, Andrew Little said they were exploring discussions on joining Pillar 2. But that exploration doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And I've noticed that Chris Hipkins, the Prime Minister, and Nanaia Mahuta have basically been quite cool in the sense of being distant from that idea.
So if Mr Blinken is here to talk with our Prime Minister, with Nanaia Mahuta as well about AUKUS, what is at stake here?
Oh, I think the stakes are huge. New Zealand in the last 2 or 3 decades has successfully branded itself globally as a non-nuclear security actor. And I think a number of actors in the Indo-Pacific, number of players, are watching us very carefully, because if we did get strong, I'm not saying we would, but if we did get strong-armed into joining Pillar 2 of AUKUS, that could blur our global brand of being a non-nuclear security player. The government insists that it wouldn't dilute their commitment to non-nuclear security, but in the eyes of countries in ASEAN and the Pacific Island states, both of whom see AUKUS as a trigger for nuclear proliferation, with Australia obtaining nuclear-powered submarines, it might be a very difficult message to, in other words, while we may think it's fine, external perceptions may well undercut that claim. And so there's a lot at stake here, and I think New Zealand may be trying to make the case to Mr Blinken that we're of greater value outside AUKUS to the United States than we are if we became a member of it.
So it's all being done around the edges of this FIFA Women's World Cup. What role does sports play in global politics today, and has that changed over time?
I think it plays a substantial role. It often provides a setting where many leaders can get together, and it's more informal than in a situation where you have a dedicated bilateral or multilateral meeting. I think sport, if anything, has become more important in global politics, and I think that reflects what an interconnected world we live in now. And these sporting events are not just regional events; they're global. They're mega events, and and as we're seeing now with New Zealand hosting, co-hosting, I ought to say, the FIFA Women's World Cup.
So what then does New Zealand co-hosting this Cup? What does that say about us and about how we are viewed?
Well, for New Zealand, two things. First of all, economically it's important. Something like 30,000 visitors will be in New Zealand. They will probably spend up to 200 million while here. So, and something like a global audience of 1.2 billion people will watch the events in both Australia and New Zealand. So for a relatively small country, not tiny, but smallish, this is a wonderful opportunity to showcase New Zealand to a much bigger audience. And the reason that's important is because countries like Australia and New Zealand are not at the forefront of the global news cycle. If you look at international coverage, United States and China have a disproportionate share much of the time. So for countries like New Zealand, it's great to remind the rest of the world that we're around, and this is an opportunity to do it. And I think the other thing is that many people who are covering the FIFA Women's Soccer World Cup have made very favourable remarks about New Zealand while being here. And it got off to a shaky start, as we saw, with unfortunately a tragic double killing in Auckland. But I think many of the journalists covering it have been struck by, first of all, the quality of the sporting infrastructure here. New Zealand didn't have to build any special stadia to accommodate the events. And of course that often happens. The countries have to outlay huge amounts of money just to host an event. But also we've shared the burden with Australia, co-hosted it. So, and that's why Anthony Albanese is over here. It's a bit of, I think it was Nanaia Mahuta, the Foreign Minister of New Zealand, said that there's a bit of old-fashioned sporting diplomacy going on here. Yes, but I think it's also a chance for Chris Hipkins and Anthony Albanese to share notes about how the event's going and also coordinating it on other fronts as well as sport.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Ka kite anō.